Good Saturday evening, everyone. I'm First Alert Meteorologist Melissa Thomas here with your News 13 educational moment of the day. We're going to take a little bit of a side road, and we're not really going to do a STEM subject today or a physical process. We're going to do a STEM history today. And we're going to dive into the rich history that is the National Weather Service, because it is over 100 years old, and the advances and its evolution is why we as broadcast meteorologists can do what we do today when forecasting the weather for our communities and communicating it to you guys. So any of your budding meteorologists out there, this is something you're going to want to study and be familiar with, because everything that you're going to study to do one day comes from the evolution of this organization in the United States. So let's dive right into it. We'll start with way back in the day in the 1849, 1850 eras, when weather enthusiasts, because whether the technology was around or not, the weather enthusiasts have always been around. And we were looking to the skies, and we were making observations, and we wanted to communicate them, and we wanted to share them. And one of the ways we did that was via telegraph, when the telegraph was invented. And the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. sent out ways to observe the weather to many different locations across the United States so that they could send their obs back to the Smithsonian and they could start drawing maps. And some of the first ever weather maps in the United States were starting to be created then. And then, about 20 years later, there's all these different ways of communicating weather that are going on in the United States. Obs that are being made, data that's being spread. And the United States says, you know what, we really want to streamline this. We want to get this all together in one spot. Because before then, people were sending weather forecasts on trains to each other, and telegraph and mailmen, and the U.S. was like, oh, we want to have a little official department that's in charge of this. And would you believe it, but the official department that became in charge of it was the War Department. The United States War Department was the first one to officially start drafting and releasing weather maps, which kind of makes sense. If you're in charge of drills and training your soldiers, you kind of want to know what the weather is before you send them out into the field to do all their running around and training. And that was in 1870, 20 years after the Smithsonian Institute sent out its request for obs so they could start drawing maps. Then in 1920, or 1872, sorry, in 1872, we actually have a preserved weather map from the U.S. War Department that was in control of drafting these weather maps up. Because you're watching TV, you see the way we communicate weather to you. We have the pretty graphics, the radar, the satellite. So I know you know that in 1870 they didn't have all that. So how did they communicate what they were observing in the atmosphere and all this data they were sharing between each other? What did it look like? Well, we have a preservation of one of those maps from 1872. And there it is. War Department weather map, an 1872 preservation of it. And as you can see, it is hand-drawn. So everyone's sharing these data observations across these locations in the United States. And the War Department officials are taking these obs and they lay out on the map of the United States, and they start writing all the different obs down, then connecting the dots to get a big picture of what the atmosphere looks like and what that tells them about the weather. Now, obviously, there's less locations back then sending obs than there are now. They didn't have satellites to confirm how precise their weather systems they were drawing are, so their forecasts were rudimentary, very, very basic, had a lot of room for error, but this is the first steps in a massive evolution and future developments to get to today's scientific developments and how well we forecast in today's society. These are the first steps. So the War Department has these weather maps that they're drafting out. Then Congress gets together and they're like, no, we don't want it to be in the War Department. We want it to be in the Department of Agriculture, which also too makes sense because, you're farming, you want to know what the weather is going to be like. It's going to rain, or you're going to have a drought. And so the U.S., and it also gets its official name of the U.S. Weather Bureau. The U.S. Weather Bureau is now officially in the Department of Agriculture, and this occurs in 1890. And then again, in 1920, Congress gets together and say, No, we don't want it in the Department of Agriculture. We want the U.S. Weather Bureau to be in the Department of Commerce. And that was in 1940. I said 20. I'm sorry. 1940. Good thing I have notes. So 1940, the U.S. Weather Bureau, now official, is under the Department of Commerce. And between 1940 and for the next 60 years, there is it just grows. And there's many different developments that start to occur that allow the U.S. Weather Bureau to do its job even more effectively on all the different parts of the weather that it wants to focus on. In 1954, the first weather radar, the first radar is established. So very, very basic radar gets put out there, and they start getting to see what the weather's doing from afar. Then in 1960, the first satellite is launched in the air, and now they can see the weather from above. So they're drawing these maps. The radar's helping them now confirm these obs, draw even more precise maps, and now we have satellites looking down to say, hey, that's exactly what we're seeing, and what we're drawing is pretty close to that. So that obviously is going to help advance our understanding of the weather, how best to visualize the data that's coming our way with satellite confirmation. Then in 1964, the National Severe Storm Laboratory is developed in Oklahoma, established in Oklahoma, Norman, Oklahoma. And that is a group of professionals that wanted to study storms and how to forecast them on a more smaller time scale so that we could get warnings out and help family members and communities be safe, because you have the satellite that shows you the big picture of the weather, the big systems that are occurring, but they wanted to really zone in on the smaller physical processes of storms, which were only a few miles wide, and that takes a lot of science, so they created their own institution for it. And then, of course, with the invention of the satellite, you got to start seeing hurricanes from above, and that just exploded hurricane science. And the National Hurricane Center was formed in 1965, where a bunch of professionals got together in southern Florida, in Miami, and wanted to specifically study hurricanes. So you have your National Severe Storm Lab in Oklahoma, you have your National Hurricane Center in southern Florida, and they're all studying different aspects of the atmosphere, from the large-scale hurricanes to the small-scale storms. And the satellites and the radars that were developed are what is allowing them to hyper-focus on these different storm systems for better forecasting purposes. And then in 1970, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is formed, or as you may know, NOAA. So when you hear NOAA, that was formed in 1970. Another thing that occurred in 1970 is pretty important for this topic. The U.S. Weather Bureau got a name change, and it officially became the National Weather Service, which is what you will hear it called today. The National Weather Service is a government institution that has many locations across the nation, and they share data, they analyze data. Broadcasters across the nation, we can do our own forecasting as well, but we access their data to help do our own forecasting, and we act as partners between each other when those times of severe weather come in play, and we're trying to make sure warnings get out as accurately as possible. There's the National Weather Service and broadcast media across the nation all work together to keep you safe. So that was in 1970. Interesting pause that I want to detour into 1977. I was trying to keep it in chronological order, but I thought this was a cool point. In 1977, satellites have now proved themselves to be amazing. And before then, with weather obs over places that you didn't have land and someone going, write down the data, send the data, they relied on ships in the ocean. So when ships were making their trips and they were moving product and they were shipping goods back and forth between Europe and the Americas, they would also send weather observations in the ocean to the weather forecasters on land. Well, satellites could see the whole ocean, and now you could really get a good picture of what was going on a more precise scale than the weather ships were offering. So the last official weather observation ship was let go in 1977. And then, that's just saying 1970s when the National Weather Service became the National Weather Service. The next big step is in the 1990s to 2000, the National Weather Service went through a huge effort of modernization, which means they had their first radar, they had their first satellite. Now they want that radar to be the best radar it can. And the radar goes through all these different evolutions, and they are doing their best to put as many radars across the nation as they can and form this really precise network. Because the more observations you have, let's see, network, yeah. That's the best way to call it. I'm missing, like, my brain's just kicked a word out of my head. I can't remember it, but a net, I guess. I think it's as simple as a net, but you want that net cast far and wide across the nation. And you want that net to be very precise with lots of little tiny crisscrosses across the region. And those crisscrosses are, different radars, different sites making observations and sharing, and to give you a most precise picture of what the atmosphere is doing. Because the more details you have, the better you can predict the next step of that weather system more accurately. And that took about 10 years and then wrapped up in 2000, so 1990 to 2000. And we have, since 2000, obviously, done a lot more refining. We have the net was cast far and wide. The radars were, further, he wanted to say evolved, but not evolved, but further refined to do their job even better. And we got so good at the data and putting that data into math equations that researchers spent decades on finessing these math equations, how well they could take all this data and calculate the next step, that we then began to roll out weather models. So now we're not just looking at the data and going, based on what we know, we think it's going to do this. We have weather models that have big computer brains that can work really fast and take these mathematical equations and say, instead of thinking what we think it's going to do, we're going to calculate what it's going to do. And it takes a big computer brain that works way faster than the human brain with all that data to process the next time step. So the next time step, an hour out, 6 hours out, 36 hours out, checking out what this weather system's going to do. And right now, we're pretty confident in the 1 to 3 day frame, 4 to 5 days getting better, and anything past 7 days is called wish casting. So we're currently trying to, the next evolution of weather forecasting is getting these models even better. And that'll take a myriad of things, finessing the mathematical equations even further, with, being done by much bigger brains than me, and the data that we're putting into it, getting even more precise data with further adding location points across the nation for OBS to put these real-time data observations into the math so that the math is as accurate as possible as forecasting the next few steps. So that's what the weather industry is doing currently. And weather forecasters, broadcasters, National Weather Service representatives, we all are taking that data every day and to the best of our abilities and to the best of the science abilities, keeping you safe and aware of what the weather's going on, what kind of weather's going on. And all of that has accumulated from that first hand-drawn basic weather map that we showed you from 1872. Now, weather broadcasters get to stand in front of graphics such as these. I mean, just think about the difference. How far weather forecasting has come. Can you imagine showing this? I mean, look at the weather system currently over Dallas. There's rain, there's some storms in there. You can see there's a satellite overlay, so the gray is the clouds, the radar is the green, the amount of rain that's falling, and even in the corner over Minneapolis, you can see blue and pink, which is snow. Can you imagine showing this moving picture, live look of what kind of weather is occurring across the nation to that gentleman that worked on that 1872 weather map for the War Department? I sometimes think about what my 12-year-old self would think about these kind of graphics based on the different radars I was looking at 12 years ago. And they were 12 years ago. Yeah, I'm a little bit older than that. 15 years ago. It was pretty basic radar images back then. This would blow my mind, let alone an 1872 War Department weather map drafter. So, anyways, I think it's really cool, and that's a little brief and tour of the history of the National Weather Service and the United States growth in learning weather, observing weather, learning weather, then predicting weather, and then developing technology to better do so. But that's the News 13, a little bit of weather a moment. We went history today versus a weather fact, or physical process. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to more segments down the road. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.